I'd like to point out this texture right here. Okay, this crack in the wall.
Yeah. Wait a minute.
Just want to make sure.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh, so that's how they made this game.
A humorous little intro there from giantbomb.com, which is a site that I'm sure many of you are familiar with at this point. Welcome to week 4. This week is on texturing. The reason I started with that clip is, other than being kind of funny, is that texturing, while it's only part of the process for creating a game asset, it can break a really good model if it's done poorly. However, if texturing is done well, it can lift a very simple model and make it look something quite exquisite within a game engine. So while this is the main week, we'll be focusing on texturing. There is a lot to cover. For assignment 1, we will just be looking at the diffuse texture or color texture for that assignment. But this week we'll be covering a range of textures and how to generate those, how to edit those in Photoshop. Most of this week will be in Photoshop. There will also be a bit of Blender and Unreal. So just again to check in and make sure that all 3 of those pieces of software are now working for you. And if you have any issues, particularly with the Adobe logins, be sure to email me and we'll sort something out for you. If you haven't tried the Adobe login already, particularly for the external students, the way you log in should be using your student email and password, and all of the students that are part of this course should be able to access Photoshop through that method. As you might notice, I'll be recording in Adobe CS5, which is relatively old at this point. It's what I've got on my machine, it's what I've got registered. Any of the functions that we'll be using in this course to do with Photoshop will be fine across all the different versions. Obviously new things have been added to Photoshop over time, but for the purposes and scope of this course, the things that I can do at home in CS5 and the things you can do in Adobe 2019, 2020 are basically the same. So we're going to be looking at layers and blend modes and basic painting and sort of operations. So fairly simple as far as Photoshop interaction goes. It'll be more about what specific things you need to do in Photoshop to get the kind of textures that you're after. So a quick rundown on textures and the different types. We'll be getting more into the specifics of these later on. Diffuse, that's often the name that is referred to as the color map. So what are the basic colors of the object? Ambient occlusion, which we will get to shortly. This is often baked from one object to another. It can also be done as a screen space thing. So if you've noticed SSAO, particularly on PC games, that stands for screen space ambient occlusion. What this does is it's basically a fake or a quick approximation that can be baked into a texture for surface shadows. So you might think of the main shadow as, you've got the player walking down a sidewalk, so the sun would be casting the main shadow of the player onto the ground. This would often be done with a shadow map or different lighting techniques. The ambient occlusion might be more if the player was holding a particular prop. So the ambient occlusion there would come into effect where the player's hand is sort of wrapped around the object and there's a little bit of shadowing between where the hand touches the object. Again, I'll show some more examples as we get into it. Tangent space normal map. So there are a couple of different types of normal maps. We will be looking at tangent space in these examples. The other main one is a object space normal map. The tangent space ones, just to know them by looking at them quickly, basically a sort of a bluey purple sort of tinge. And the object space normal maps are often more of a wider variety of colors. These basically take the red, the green, and the blue channels of an image and use that to adjust the lighting for the X, the Y, and the Z coordinates on a mesh. Normal maps are very handy. They can either be hand painted or baked from one object to another, and they allow for the game engine to look like there is much more detail going on, but maintaining a very low poly count. And again, we will be looking at these more as we go. Roughness, metallic, and specular. So the reason I've put all 3 of those as kind of the same thing There are different spots in Unreal Engine 4 for the 3 different maps, but they're all effectively trying to achieve the same goal, which is how reflective is that object. So if you think of something like a polished piece of chrome, for example, on a car, that would have a roughness that is very, very close to 0. So it is highly polished, which is the opposite of rough. That would also, in a metallic slider, be a value of 1. So metallic is often the opposite of roughness. So things on a metallic map, if they were a value of 0 or black, they would not be metallic at all. They would also have a value of 1 on, say, a roughness map, because they're very, very rough. There's not much of a shine to it. So something like that might be if you've had some wood that you've taken a bit of sandpaper to and it's kind of roughed up. There's no polish on the outer edge of the wood. It's not a particularly reflective material at all. So that might have a roughness of 1 and a metallic value of 0 or black. Where the specular map sort of comes in is things like plastic might have a very high polish to them, but plastic doesn't reflect in the same way that metal does. So there are a couple of ways to go about this. One might be using a roughness of 1, a metallic of 0, and then having a specular map on top of that. But yeah, there may be other ways of combining those nodes, because specular specifically, it still has its uses, but it's much more of a technique that was around for computer graphics before we had very nice reflections, either in a game engine or through ray tracing, which would be the way you would do it if you were rendering a cutscene through animation and render engines and such. So again, specular still has its uses, but we'll be focusing more on the roughness and metallic maps, because specifically with Unreal Engine 4, there are quite nice reflections going on, and so you'll get, broadly speaking, a more accurate sort of result that way. So to sum up the value of textures and where they sit in the game asset creation pipeline, if you've got a very flat mesh, the mesh is largely defining the silhouette and the overall form of the object, so what shape it takes, whereas the textures and how they affect the materials, textures are much more about defining the surface finish of an object. So is this made of a certain type of material, like wood or glass or solid metal? That is the basic nuts and bolts of what the textures do. They define different parts of the mesh. They're not sort of bound to the same edges of the polygons, so you can blend between different surfaces. But yes, they take the very flat, very boring, grey looking polygons and the low res amount of detail that those can hold within a game engine, and once you apply the textures, they start to look like this, which has the 4 textures that have been on the screen while I've been talking about the different examples. So this is where we're going to be ending up for the prac today. I'll cover based on the texture bakes of the ambient occlusion and the normal map, which I will have supplied. We'll be going through and seeing how you go from a couple of baked textures using a bit of photo manipulation and basic layer work in Photoshop to get the normal map and the ambient occlusion, which we already have, but how to generate the color or diffuse map and also the roughness map from these bakes. Before we get into any of that, however, if the basic definition of textures that we've looked at so far is that textures are defining the surface quality of an object, there is another way to look at this, which is something that I want to emphasize, that can take a very basic object and turn it into a very meaningful object for your game. If you look at it from the slightly different point of view of textures tell a story about the history and character of an object, effectively what we'll be doing in Photoshop and what you'll be doing in the painting or sculpting or however you generate your textures, it'll be the same technical process, but it's something to keep in mind about your textures and how to make the jump from, this looks like a basic bit of metal, to this looks like it's integrated as part of the world and part of the story that I'm trying to tell. So what do I mean by that, and how is that different from, well, a metallic texture defines this is metal, this isn't? A good example of this is the following. Now, I'm not about to start the debate of which is better, but we're going to look at these two examples of two objects within film, but have also appeared in many different games and toys and all the rest of it, that are effectively quite similar, but how the surface finish or the textures of both of these objects define what they are as surfaces, but also what they are as a living, breathing part of the story and galaxy in which they both come from. So to compare the similarities first, both are obviously spaceships, both are mostly grey in overall colour, both have a crew, both are effectively structures created by a series of metallic panels. The metal isn't particularly glossy on either of them, and both have glowing sections that indicate, this is part of the engine. When this glows, the ship moves forward. So at a basic level, there is a lot going on for these two objects that is the same. So from a texturing point of view of the materials, both would have similar textures for the sort of overall roughness. It's meant to look like metal, but not polished metal by any means. Both are going to be largely grey in the diffuse or colour texture, and both will have some emissive textures to imply this is the engine, and when it glows there is energy coming out of it. However, both are very, very different in terms of their character. So we'll start off first discussing the Enterprise on the left. The Enterprise is one ship as part of a much, much larger fleet. So what that comes with is there is also a large crew on board this specific ship. It belongs to a large organization that has a lot of maintenance facilities, a lot of financial backing. This means that the ship is well maintained, it's kept clean, it's repaired after any battles or scuffles. Obviously the ship does get damaged at some points, but it is meticulously maintained and taken care of. Both interior of the ship through the crew and the exterior through the maintenance and when it docks at various space stations and parts of the Federation. It is resupplied regularly. It is run like clockwork. So how this is reflected in the texture is it's been made to a very specific design. A lot of the metallic panels, you can barely see the gaps between the panels. It's all machined very precisely. A lot of sort of very even detail, a lot of very clean detail. The color texture is not going to have a whole lot of grime or dirt in it, because even if they've been out on all these different adventures and damaging the ship and all sorts of adventures, it always comes back and it is always maintained and it is always held to a certain very, very specific standard. However, if we compare that with the second mostly grey spaceship on the right, the Millennium Falcon, you can probably guess where I'm going with this analogy, but this ship is a ship run by a crew of 2 and a crew of smugglers. They don't have much time for cleaning it. They don't have much time for repairing it. Whilst it looks like some parts of the overall panels might be a sort of a more uniform width in the ship when it was built initially, there are panels of different random colours. There are bits that look like they've been bolted on, bits that look like they're almost about to fall off, bits that are burnt, bits that are dented and missing. This is a ship that is lived in and lived in roughly. It gets up to arguably similar adventures as the Enterprise. It sees battles, it sees crash landings, all sorts of things. However, it is maintained on a budget. It is also maintained in a very rough sort of way, as if Han and Chewie had just gone to the scrapyard every time they need a new part and think, oh, well, okay, that fits, we'll use that, we'll move on. So the ship has a visual history to it. From a story point of view, both ships have a history to them, but the Millennium Falcon wears its history on the outside. Every time it's been dented or banged up, that dent is probably left there. So if you were to compare both of these to sort of real-world references, which is also something that you should be doing when defining any game asset, whether it's the model or the look of the textures, is getting real-world references. The Enterprise being a ship as part of a broader navy. You know, I know that it's not, the Federation is not quite a military force, but, you know, the crew is very disciplined and holds everything to a certain standard. Whereas the Millennium Falcon is much more the beat up but much loved project car. Things are done to a budget. Some things are improved, like the speed. Other things are ignored, like the appearance. And it gets the job done. So how this is obviously reflected in the textures on the Millennium Falcon. Again, mostly grey, but you will see there is a lot more dirt and grime. There is bits of rust. There is bits of oil leaking over the panels. There are blaster marks. There's just damage all over the place. So again, mostly grey, but if you look in closely, you'll see that it's not all the same type of grey. There's like off-coloured parts and just a whole lot more variety going on visually. A lot of the parts that might be part of the texture instead of a mesh, depending on how high-res the final product is all the pipes, and a lot of the systems seem to be externally bolted onto the ship. This also can imply that things need to be maintained real easy. It's not going to spend a whole lot of time out of action. They need access to various parts to just fix it and move on. So again, that comes through, and that might be part of the texturing, because I doubt that most game engines would be able to hold the entirety of the Millennium Falcon with all of those different little pipes and bolts and extra parts that are going on. So similarly, if we were to take a character-based example and an example out of an actual game engine, this is obviously from Assassin's Creed Odyssey. A quick side note, for those of you who aren't familiar with websites like ArtStation and ZBrush Central, it's pretty common these days for a lot of larger games and the art teams on them to, once the game is public, release a whole lot of imagery, which we'll be looking at how to create more of in the portfolio section later on in the semester, where they can take the assets that they've been working on for the game and showcase them for everyone to look at. I find myself looking at these types of showcases a lot, particularly because, as well as just the object being in the game and you can see it and it's running, that's fine. Often the objects are moving or running real fast away from you, or you know, you don't necessarily get to appreciate all the detail that goes in when the object is actually in the game. They're also able to use whatever lighting sort of engine they want, and show the high-res ZBrush models. Obviously, as polygon counts are increasing and increasing, the difference between them is becoming less with the appearance in the final game. But sometimes you'll take a look at the actual ZBrush sculpture that went into a polygonal mesh, and just be able to take in all the details from a still or a rendered turntable, and see exactly all the work that went into creating that various character or prop or environment. I don't necessarily play a whole lot of Assassin's Creed these days, but it is an example of a long-running franchise where the art team, pretty consistently on each game, you'll be able to find content like this, more or less dating back to Assassin's Creed 2. There'd also be some content of the first one out there, but after each sort of installment, it's pretty easy to find art either as posted as a team or posted by the individual artists that showcase a lot of what went into making these assets as elaborately detailed as they are. So what we can see here in this image is the armor of Agamemnon. Having not played the game, I am making an assumption here, but given that the player is a Spartan and they often try and do the underdog thing, I would suggest that this is probably the main villain that you sort of lead up to. We can look at from a texturing point of view. Obviously, all that we're looking at is variations of metal, and then some dyed, presumably horsehair, but animal hair, in the top of the helmet. Again, that is the basic surface finish of the object. The metal is obviously much glossier, or to put it another way, is less rough on the shoulder pad as it is on most other parts of the helmet. We can also see that some of the raised areas, particularly on the forehead, on the helmet, have lost a bit of the color and are also a bit glossier. This is a pretty common thing with texturing. If an object has been scuffled or, dragged along the ground. It might have some of the color or the paint or the surface highlight might be worn a bit more. So this can often reflect in, the edges of the object becoming a bit shinier, a bit less saturated, if the paint's sort of come off or whatever. And conversely, the other thing that you would often want to do in your textures, and we'll have a bit more of a look at this later, is the creases where things are a little bit more hidden. They're not going to rub against other items as much. There would be sort of more dirt gathering in those areas and grime, so they tend to be a little bit darker. The original paint might be there more because it's had less chance to be rubbed off. But yes, to continue looking at this example, there is a lot of detail going on. There's a lot of fine hand-carved detail, whether that would be in the casting process to make his various armor, or whether they'd sort of etched in various different processes that people would have used at the time and could use now to physically make these objects, is reflected in the texture. So all that detail, specifically for something like armor, reflects that while it's functional, the elaborate detail in it reflects that this is also a wealthy or powerful character. Pretty straightforward to see, because we know that if we were to create this type of armor for real, having elaborately detailed scenes and figures carved into every single plate of the armor, obviously we're just looking at the head and shoulders here, would take a whole lot of time and be very expensive to do. And for something that is designed to protect you, having all that detail put in is largely ceremonial and, again, a show of wealth. We can also tell from the color texture, and this is as much an art direction thing as anything else. Colors mean different things in different cultures, but in this particular sense, the use of very dark colors, almost tinted black in most places, and the red, both of which are seen as generally being very aggressive. This is also reflected a bit in the actual model, where there is shadow cast over the eyes, and yes, that all basically leads to this is a wealthy, powerful character that is not to be messed with, and is very typical but very good way of sort of establishing this is the lead bad guy or person that you will be fighting in this game. So, same game, different character example. We have yet another character that has a helmet and shoulder pad and armor in general from the same time period, same location. While there are similarities between this and the last one, there's still, a carved face in the shoulder pad. We can tell several things from both the model and the texture surface finish. So, firstly, this character is not completely armored. That might be partially for mobility, but it's also more likely for the cost of it. Agamemnon, while we were only looking at the sort of head and shoulders, that character is clad in armor from head to toe, and all of the character's armor has detail on pretty much every part. This character not having nearly as much armor and being a bit more exposed could lead to one of the two conclusions that obviously this character might need to move around a whole lot more, or they weren't able to afford the full suit of armor that Agamemnon had. This is sort of backed up as well by the texture detail, that whilst there is detail in there and there is carving and work that has gone into it, there is a lot less elaborate detail. So it's clear that either the character that is wearing this or the blacksmith that forged it still takes pride in their art. They want to have some level of detail in there, but they know either as a character or as a blacksmith, they are running on a budget. They can't afford to spend all this amount of time making the armor. They probably made one sort of mold, and then duplicates of this would have been churned out either for the army or for the gladiators. And yeah, so it shows that there is still a sense of pride in making it, and culturally that this type of detail in the armor was very much the style at the time. So if you think more of like a stormtrooper, the Empire doesn't care much for details, so that is all very functional. Similarly, like modern day police with the SWAT teams, everything on that SWAT sort of outfit would have a function, a whole lot of, pockets and overlapping vests and, seams to minimize where the armor would be penetrated. Art doesn't really enter into it at that point. It's very, very functional, whereas this armor is still a mix of both. So also with the texture having less carved detail in it, we can see that while the sort of overall color is sort of a goldy bronze, the colors aren't uniformly as dark, so we can tell that this is still a soldier or gladiator of some type, and as such is a fighter, and the big pointed base of the mask is still showing that this is somewhat of an aggressive shape. But we can see from the actual colouring that a lot of it has faded and has started to turn a greeny blue. So just from a metalworking background, this is known as a patina. It showed that the metal is old, it's been exposed to the air a lot, and that is naturally a process that happens over time. But this is armor that has been worn for a while, it's been worn in the elements, and it's starting to show its age. So where Agamemnon's armor would have been polished or painted and kept in a state of good repair, rarely ever used, probably kept indoors most of the time, this is armor that gets used probably every day. So again, a fairly simple thing to show with the textures. The patina is much more in the recesses, so in the grooves and dents, whereas the exterior parts of the metal, or the bits that sort of protrude or jut out on the edges, that's still where it's got most of its shine and most of its original color, because as the soldier sort of rolls around on the ground or runs into another soldier or clashes or grapples, the exterior parts of the metal are sort of what get rubbed against each other and still maintain some sort of a polish. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show from those two examples there. But again, a sort of a real in-game example of two very similar objects, the armor types, and how the texturing can play a part in what that character is underneath. So if we were to take a look at the example object that we'll be looking at in the practical, we can see that it is made of a metallic main plate, sort of to guard the forearm. This is 2 tones of metal, so that would have been plated in gold or brass or something to basically take the main plate of metal and add a secondary color of metal to it. These smaller panels that sit between the cloth wrap and the metal guard, I sort of imagine these as being little squares of carved wood, something a bit different. Wood's not often used in armor in that way. Could also be, obviously if it was textured differently, some carved stone or jade or something along those lines. And then of course we have the cloth wrap itself. So again, that is the basics of the textures defining the surface quality of the actual mesh. So which polygons or which specific parts of this piece of armor are made of what physical material. But if we were to look at this in terms of what story is the textures telling about this particular piece of armor, and by extension the character that would be wearing it. First of all, we can see that the metal guard plate, whilst it has some small dents and pock marks, there's not really a whole lot of actual damage done to it. So a little bit of wear and tear, and the piece itself is in reasonably good condition. It's been highly polished because there is a very high sheen to the metal. In other words, a roughness close to 0, or a metallic close to 1. This shows that this particular piece of armor, the metal plate, has been polished, and whilst it might be a bit of an older piece, it has been maintained. Similarly, from the cloth wraps, the color is starting to fade. It's getting a little bit threadbare in places. We can see that this is a well-worn cloth strap, so perhaps the character lives in this armor. They don't take it off. They're constantly on the road. But yes, the cloth is well worn, similarly to the plate. The little wooden pieces, again, because they're not as exterior as the metal, there's not quite as much wear going on there. But yeah, there's a bit of discoloration here and there. So overall, an aged but in still good condition piece of equipment. So possibly based on the level of detail in the guard as well. This might be an officer in a particular sort of military force. They have been serving for a while. They're serving constantly in the outdoors. It's not a sort of a sit behind a desk kind of position. They get out there and fight with the troops, but at the same time, they're in a bit of a higher position of status because there is that detail there. Also, whilst they've been doing this for a while and there is wear and tear, the character has been maintaining their armor as best they can because that's part of the discipline of what they do. So it might sound a bit like I'm just sort of repeating the same thing over and over again to do with the history of the object and the wear and tear. It's not something you consciously need to think about with absolutely every object in your game. Sometimes a rock in the background is just a rock in the background and that's all it needs to be. But it is definitely something to keep in mind when working on an asset, particularly if it's an asset that's going to be seen a whole lot. For example, something that's going to be physically on the character or the player's character themselves. If it's a part of the character's sort of home base or however your sort of game is structured. Part of the menus, if you've got any particular 3D objects that show up in the sort of in-game menus. It's worth putting that thought in, and it's more or less the same thought each time of what is this object? What has it gone through? Is it looked after? Is it made from cheap materials? Is it made from very expensive, sort of highly crafted materials? And just asking those sort of initial questions as you start the texturing to give that object a bit of a backstory and make it fit better within your game overall. So, Photoshop. I'm going to run with the assumption, based on asking students in the first sort of practical, that most people will have had at least some basic interaction with Photoshop before, so I'll keep this part of the video pretty quick. For those of you who haven't really used Photoshop before, and again, the most recent Photoshop will have a slightly different UI to this, but the principles are all the same. Photoshop is a 2D image program, and its main functionality is through the various different layers and the various different filters which can be accessed from the top menu. So if I was to, on my ambient occlusion map, create a new layer and select a region of the image, this one is the rectangular marquee tool. The polygonal lasso tool can also be very handy for quickly getting parts of the texture set up. I can then select a color. Say we wanted this all to be a sort of a gold tint. This will create a new layer with just that selection, and it will be a solid color. So you can blend between the different layers in different ways. By default, it'll be set to normal, because that is often what you want. Opacity, so that will be, you know, how transparent or how opaque an object is. If that term is new to you for some reason, opacity is just the inverse of saying transparency. So if something is 100% opaque, it'll be 100% visible. If something is 100% transparent or 0% opaque, you won't see it. So again, that translates into the actual game engine. If you were to use an alpha texture for, say, hair strands or something, it would be a grayscale texture for the alpha, more often than not, that would define, you know, if this fades into black in the alpha channel, it'll be completely transparent. If it fades into white, it'll be 100% opaque and you'll be able to see it rendered. For now, there's a couple of different options. If we set that to color, that has tinted both in hue and saturation, everything underneath it. If we were to go just hue, what this is saying is everything on the layer underneath it should be of that yellow hue, but because it is all black and white image anyway. There's no saturation on it, so it won't actually appear as being any color. Similarly, if we were to do just saturation and blend that over the top, the grayscale image underneath it is now matching the same saturation, but there is no hue assigned, so it doesn't know what color to make that either. So color does both at the same time. Another very common one is the multiply, which will basically take the brightness and the color and the saturation and multiply it with whatever's underneath it. So us to do image adjustments levels and make that darker, it would keep multiplying that color over the top until you get black multiplied over anything is just going to end up black. So also there are things like overlay and soft light that I use. Screen and linear dodge can also come quite in handy. We'll get to these more specifically in the practicals. The basic interaction is you have an image, you load it up, you create different layers. The layers are then blended together in different ways, and that is eventually how you create your texture. The ambient occlusion map is often a very handy one to start with. I find that I often use that as a base to make the color texture and also the metallic or specular textures. This is because as I've been talking with the different armor examples and the Millennium Falcon and all that, ambient occlusion by its nature is very good at showing up the highlights and edges of an object and the darker parts, the creases, the recesses of an object. So because it's got all that information already baked into it, if you happen to be making the textures from one object to another, the information in this map can be tweaked as the starting point for various other maps. If, however, you are starting from scratch and weren't baking from one object to another, which is the recommended process for assignment 1, because we don't have the high-res mesh to bake from, only the low poly, what you'll need to do is unwrap it first. UV unwrapping we covered last week in case you missed it. And once your object is unwrapped, you can then go to UVs, export UV layout. This will bring up the file save as dialog. So you would then label that UV layout. And I believe it defaults to PNG there. You can also set the size of this exported texture. Doesn't matter a whole lot as you're only really going to use it as a guide. This won't end up as an actual image file in Unreal. But if we export that there, open Photoshop, and bring in our UV layout by dragging and dropping it into Photoshop, we can see that's half the scale of our current texture. To scale an object, you can do Control or Command T and drag that to the corners. It should snap to. Hit enter and away we go. You will also notice there is a slight margin on the baked textures, which we covered in week 1. This margin basically helps with MIP mapping and level of detail meshes. So as the player is getting closer and closer to an object and the engine is swapping in the higher and higher res meshes and textures, this margin here helps mask any of that transition, and it also helps with this being one UV border along the edge and then down the bottom. It helps blend the two edges together if there's a bit of margin between them. If we were to mute both of these layers, this is what we would get as our sort of default for bringing in the UV layout texture. The next step would either to be paint everything from scratch in Photoshop, which you could do by initially making a new layer, picking a particular part like the metal plate, putting that to a flat gray, because you know that's going to be the base of that particular part of the color, and then either painting with a Wacom if you have one, or using the mouse to get the sort of the texture going. Another common thing to do in terms of texturing, particularly if you're starting from scratch, and again we'll be using this method to make adjustments to the baked textures, is to drag in, say, an existing photo texture, put it into place, and we then start to paint on that. You'll see from the naming of this texture, although the font's quite small, this is from textures.com. Textures.com is a free resource. There are paid options if you want to get some of the specific files or some of the higher res images, but it is a good starting point for a lot of photos and textures that have been generated with texture artists in mind. So a lot of the photos you will get online or you take yourself will often have different types of lighting, whereas all you really want is sort of, for like a more wood example, you want that to be as uniformly lit as possible because the game engine is going to be lighting over the top of it. So we don't want any lighting information baked into our textures where possible. But if we were to right click and do rasterize layer, often when you've dragged an item in, it'll keep it as a smart object. The rasterize just means that we're able to edit it and paint on it. So just using the mouse here as an example, UV layout, don't need to be that obvious with it. A smaller brush. The hardness or softness of the brush is exactly what it sounds like. Hardness to 0 will give you a much softer fall off, which isn't necessarily always what you want, but usually is. So this would then, if you Alt left click, gives you a color picker, which you can sort of use to, it says pick a color from underneath the mouse at that particular location. We would probably have it smoother in the center because a lot of the grunge and grime would be, again, getting into the sort of the corners of the mesh. We could then decrease our brush size, turn the opacity up, and again, because the edges are raised, there would be a much sort of cleaner edge due to that edge of the very edge of the armor plate being what's sort of getting hit or knocked around, or yeah, it sort of maintains its polish because the outer edge is what's rubbing up against other objects from day-to-day use or combat or moving around. Overall, that's probably going to be too dark, so we could then do image, adjustments, curves. I use curves and levels a fair bit. Bringing this side up will bring everything closer to white. Bringing that down will bring everything closer to black. So if we wanted this to be a very dull grey, but for nothing to get 100% black, we might do something along those lines. This can also be done for hue saturation. At the moment, dragging saturation will do nothing because there's no saturation on it at all. If we were to check colorize, that'll assign a color. We can specify which one by dragging along the slider. Don't want it too saturated. We want it sort of a bit of an off blue perhaps, and can uniformly adjust the brightness there as well. So if you are starting a texture from scratch, those are some of the basic operations within Photoshop. I'll be recording separate content for the actual practical, or if you're one of the internal students, we'll be running it through live in the practical session, and yeah, we'll go from there. One more key thing to note about any image that you would grab and use in your texture, whether it's from Google image search or textures.com, is to always check the copyright information. Sites like this will often have under About Us terms of use. Be sure to check this and make sure that your project and that your use of the textures matches up with these conditions. It seems like a bit of a nitpick, but it is a case where if you've done this wrong and the company finds out that you've used copyrighted images, there can be legal penalties for this. So it's best to just avoid it from the start. The easiest way to do that is if you're going to need reference imagery, to take the imagery yourself, because then, if you've taken reference photos of wood or stone or whatever you need, you know that the licensing is fine because it's content that you've taken. The next best thing is to find anything that's public domain, because again, there will be no legal rights sort of held over that. But if you're going to use an online service, be sure to check the terms and conditions and the About site for anywhere that you get any reference images. That sums up the lecture for this week. If you have any further questions, obviously texturing is a very, very large subject, and we're mostly focusing on it for this 1 week. This week, just try and focus on your one diffuse texture for assignment 1, and we'll get to the rest of the textures mostly when we're doing baking and transferring details from high-res meshes to low-res later on. Thank you.